Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Tampa. My name is Ed Benedict and I'm your worship associate today. It's a pleasure to see you here, particularly since the day is turning off to be such a nice one. I'd like to welcome you if you're a first-time visitor to our church, and I hope that you might hear something that'll bring you back and stay with us for a while. If you're a person who has been coming for a while, welcome to you also, and I hope that you're finding things and getting your spiritual value from this church. If you're a longtime member of this church, thank you for your contributions during this COVID time that has kept us open, as we've resumed operations and kept us open actually during the COVID period and kept our employees paid. We appreciate it greatly. I said, please join us on Christmas Eve for services Friday, that's this coming Friday at 6 p.m. It'll be followed by Fudge Sundays in front of the multi-purpose building. So to repeat that, the Reverend Jim McComber will be working Christmas Eve along with Santa. He gets the next day off along with Santa. And then on the 26th, Boxing Day, the church is taking the day off, so there won't be services next Sunday. Our guest speaker today is one of us. It's Chuck Smith. Chuck has been a member of this church now for 10 years. During that time, he has served us on the Board of Trustees, and he's a regular at Buildings and Ground and today on that program too. Prior to coming to Tampa, Chuck was a member of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania for 33 years. He is a retired professor of mechanical engineering, having taught at both Purdue and Lehigh universities for a total of 40 years. He lives in Lutz, Florida, which is about 15 miles from us here at this particular time. He's going to speak to us today on the subject of growing up with polio. If you read The Blast, you know that in 1953, Chuck contracted that disease when he was 9 years of age. So he's going to talk about his recovery from that and make some comparisons to the COVID epidemic or pandemic that we're going through now. The next procedure that I'd like to open is our stone ritual. As you know, that we have temporarily stopped it during the COVID period for health reasons, but I can still do it for you virtually. And that is, I'm going to take 3 stones. The first stone I will put in the sand to set an intention for the coming week. The second one will be perhaps a high point in my life or your life for the past week, and the last one will be a sorrow if you have one of those. Intention for the coming week, a joy for the past week, and finally, perhaps a sorrow for the past week. And now, Chuck has some opening words, and I'll light this chalice.
Thank you, Ed. I'd like to thank the worship committee for inviting me here to talk about my experiences with polio. I'm sure that most of you had no idea that I had that debilitating disease. While it is not the most cheerful topic to discuss during the holiday season, I hope you'll leave today understanding more about a disease that ravaged the world more than 100 years before it was essentially eradicated by the development of a vaccine. I wouldn't be here today describing my experiences if it wasn't for my grandson, Rowan, who in the summer of 2020 sent me an email saying that his dad, Brian, told him that I had polio when I was a child. Rowan asked if I could describe what it was like. Much of what I'll talk about today is from my email response to Rowan. Rowan, thank you for asking. Later in the service, I'm going to tell you my polio story. But here I wanted to give you some facts about the disease, since we're going through a pandemic now with a similar disease. And it's very much similar to what's happening with COVID. Polio, like COVID, is a viral disease. It was first detected in the 1800s, but probably been around much longer than that. Okay, the first, next slide. And this shows sort of the progression of the polio epidemics. It became much more prevalent in the early 1900s, with an epidemic occurring in 1916. And then the cases subsided, but were still prevalent until around World War II, when the disease started to increase with another epidemic in the 1950s. Polio is transmitted orally, as opposed to COVID, which is transmitted by your nasal passages. And it was transmitted by swallowing infectious droplets of saliva or other bodily fluids from an infected person. Polio, like COVID, had several different strains and exhibited many degrees of severity, similar to what we see with COVID. And have the next slide. If you look at that pie chart and the colors, the biggest piece of pie up there is what's called inapparent polio. And that's about 70% of the cases. And these were the type where people didn't have symptoms, but still could pass the virus to others. The blue, which is about 25%, it's called abortive, and that's where cases with mild symptoms. And you would have a mild symptom similar to the flu. And the illness didn't appear to affect the spinal cord or the brain. And people generally recovered within about a week. Then in the yellow, it's called non-paralytic meningitis. In about 5% of the cases, this was the effect. And there was an inflammation of the brain and the spinal cord membranes, and was characterized by fever, headache, back pain, and stiffness, with some possible nerve damage. However, individuals generally recovered over a longer extended period of time. And finally, the most dreaded is that little sliver up there, which was a little less than 1%, and that was paralytic polio. And it quickly caused significant weakness, which led to permanent paralysis and possibly death. And while many people contracted the disease, only about 5% required hospitalization, and only 1% or less had any long-term paralytic effects. But they were very severe and very disfiguring in many cases. And unlike COVID, which primarily affects adults, polio affected very young children, so it was much more apparent when a young child got the disease, particularly the paralytic type. And you can show the next slide. And this just shows you a couple of unsettling pictures of children who had the disease at a young age. And of course, that would carry through with them through the rest of their life. Comparatively, COVID is much more deadly than polio, more than 10 times. Slide 5, please. However, it's possible to recover from COVID and return to normal health. But if you contract a severe case of polio, you develop permanent life-changing paralysis and disfiguration. Now, a list of famous people who contracted polio and recovered or were left with some kind of degree of paralysis is pretty long. And many of the younger people won't recognize some of the names, because these are people who were all born before 1950, when polio was an epidemic. For instance, Joni Mitchell, singer-songwriter, had polio as a young girl, and it weakened her left arm, so she had to play the guitar differently than most normally able people. Joni Weissmailer, he was a multiple Olympic gold medalist in swimming in the 1920s and later played Tarzan in the movies. He had non-paralytic polio when he was 9 years old. His doctor said he should take up an active sport to help his long recovery. He chose swimming. Probably a good choice. And you probably heard the music of Itzhak Perlman, the virtuoso violinist. He caught polio at age 2, which required him to wear leg braces the rest of his life when performing. Other notables that you probably didn't know had varying effects of polio. Jack Nicklaus, the famous golfer. Wilbur Rudolph, who was a gold medalist in running in the Olympics. Dinah Shore, an actress. And Alan Alda, who played Hawkeye on MASH. They all had some degree of polio. And finally, probably the most noted is Franklin Roosevelt, 32nd President of the United States, who developed polio symptoms at age 39, which was very late. And after a long recovery, he required leg braces the rest of his life, and all during the time he was president, in order to be able to stand. So I'll be back in a few minutes to tell you my polio story.
Please rise in body or in spirit and join in singing hymn number 1015, I Know I Can. I'm going to play it through one time, as it might be new for some of us.
Chuck has selected our words for meditation today, and they're very appropriate for this time. Let us open our minds and hearts to the place of quiet, to the silent prayer for healing of pain, and the soft, gentle coming of love.
In 1953, I was 9 years old and living in Los Angeles, California. With apologies to Charles Dickens, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. I had spent the summer riding my new bicycle, playing baseball with my friends, and attending a YMCA day camp twice a week. Among camp activities was swimming in a big swimming pool, which was filled with lots and lots of other young boys. Slide, please. Next slide. Okay. 1953 was also the summer of the worst polio epidemic since 1916. And that peak is the epidemic, that little red arrow indicates when I got polio. On a Sunday in August of 1953, I was at a large picnic with my family when I suddenly felt very ill. I got a terrible headache and started vomiting. My parents took me home, took my temperature, which was high, gave me aspirin, put me to bed, and hoped that the illness would pass. However, the next day I felt worse, my temperature was higher, I couldn't eat, and I felt stiff and weak. Next slide, please. Those are the symptoms of polio at the time. The red arrows indicate all the symptoms that I had, which were coincident with that. My mother took me to our family doctor, who examined me and made a probable diagnosis of the onset of polio. In 1953, there was no polio vaccine. How I caught polio, I will never know, but it's transmitted by saliva and poop. So, like COVID, a sneeze or touching an unwashed hand, putting your hand in your mouth, could pass the disease. Unlike COVID, which is contracted by your nasal passages, polio is transmitted by mouth, or was transmitted by mouth, with the virus entering your bloodstream through your intestines. My best guess is I contracted polio from the YMCA pool that I shared with all those other boys, of whom one or more had polio but didn't have symptoms or had only minor symptoms. After making his diagnosis of polio, my doctor sent us to the Los Angeles County General Hospital, a very big hospital which had very good polio treatment. I was tested, they checked the saliva and the poop, and my doctor's diagnosis was confirmed. I had polio. That was the bad news. Even worse news was that because polio is a communicable disease like COVID, I could have no outside visitors. Also, like our COVID pandemic, communicable disease wings of the hospitals were essentially packed with polio patients. Okay, there we go. Initially, there was no regular bed for me in the polio ward. So I spent my first day and night on a movable bed out in a hallway of the hospital until a bed was made available the next day. I was first moved to an intensive care room with one other person. As my illness got worse and then better, I was transferred through a series of different rooms with different levels of care. Now, polio is incurable, but they began treating me with something that was called gamma globulin, a component of blood plasma that's extracted from donated blood. Gamma globulin contains antibodies that protects the body against bacterial and viral infections. The use of gamma globulin is termed passive immunization and was developed during World War II to treat wounded soldiers, but it started to be used experimentally on polio victims in 1953. This passive immunization is similar to that treatment of very ill COVID victims who were injected with plasma extracted from the blood of COVID survivors The hope is that the plasma antibodies will fight off the COVID disease. The gamma globulin must have helped. My body fought off the disease. I survived the illness, for which I am eternally grateful. My religious Christian mother, thought that my recovery was due to prayers by a prayer group she organized at our church, which prayed for me every day. I appreciate that they prayed for my recovery, but I prefer to think that the gamma globulin was what helped me recover. But then, who knows? So what was my experience like as a 9-year-old boy in the communicable disease ward of the big hospital? The first several days were scary and lonely. No one could visit. I was confined to a hospital bed, and I felt terrible. And I had no outside stimulation. Hospitals in 1953 had no television in the rooms, and I had no books or other material to read. I also had an intravenous drip in my in my arm, to keep my fluid levels up, since I had difficulty swallowing. They did this through a rigid steel needle inserted in a vein in my arm, which was attached to a bottle of fluid by a long plastic tube. Today, if you go in the hospital, you get a plastic shunt, which is a very flexible insertion in your arm, which allows your arm to be able to be moved. Back then, since they used a rigid needle, which could damage your arm if you moved it, they had to immobilize your arm, so they taped my arm to a piece of board. And then you had to lie on your back and not move. You know, think about what it's like. You're a 9-year-old boy, and that's the situation. It was pretty difficult. It was very uncomfortable, and they also kept the lights on all the time, only dimming them a little bit at night. So the light made sleeping difficult, and here you are on your back with this thing on your arm. And it struck me that it's kind of ironic that they would leave the lights on since you're supposed to go to a hospital to rest. You know, and if any of you have been to a hospital recently and had things, I often wonder, you know, what is the purpose of this? You know, I get more rest at home than I do at a hospital. Now, to add to the scary aspect of this, my second day in the hospital, I was taken to an operating room where they took a sample of my spinal fluid to examine for the polio virus. That slide there. It's called a spinal tap, something you don't want to have. It's done with a very big needle and a syringe, and it's quite painful. And when you're a 9-year-old boy alone in a strange environment, the initial sight of such a very big needle is absolutely frightening. Now, initially, my condition got worse, and there was some discussion by doctors and nurses on whether I needed to be placed in an iron lung machine to help me breathe. Next slide. This is a picture of a young man in an iron lung. It's a big cylindrical containment vessel which your whole body is put into, and only your head is allowed to come out. And that young man's smiling. Let me tell you, I never saw anybody who was in an iron lung smile, other than for a picture. An iron lung basically compresses and expands the air within that chamber in which your body is placed. This causes your chest to also compress and expand, basically breathing for you. Next slide. This is a picture of what it was like in 1953 in a ward of iron lungs, all filled with children being cared for, and hopefully surviving it long enough to recover. Many of Those people did survive, some of them did not. I was fortunate. After 6 days in the hospital, I started to improve. I never did have to go into an iron lung, which I am also eternally thankful. As I improved, I was moved to a big room called a ward with lots of beds with recovering polio patients. Next slide. This is just a picture I find. I have no pictures of when I was there because it was an isolation environment, but this is one that I found. And this is in a hospital gym. And just like today with COVID, they were desperate to find enough space for the recovering patients. And so this is the recovery ward in the hospital gym that they set up. And those are all young people who are recovering from the disease. So in the ward, nurses would exercise my arms and legs, which were stiff, and they'd wrap them with hot, wet strips cut from woolen blankets. This is part of what's called the Sister Kinney polio treatment process. It was done to stimulate the muscles. What I remember is that the hot blankets made me itch and caused a rash, which made, again, the process uncomfortable. You can see a pattern here. However, no more needles and no more boards. Okay. I had not been out of bed in the hospital since I entered. And one night in the ward, I badly needed to go to the bathroom. I tried to get out of the bed by myself. Big mistake. When my feet hit the floor, I couldn't stand and I collapsed. Luckily, a nurse came by, got me to the bathroom, back in bed. So, my immune system, and maybe the gamma globulin, had fought a battle with the virus and won. Sort of. While my body defeated the virus, my body was left stiff and very weak. After 19 days in the LA hospital, I was transferred to a rehabilitation hospital. It was much nicer than being in a regular hospital, and it was near my parents' home. And until that point, I hadn't seen my family in 19 days. Remember, I was 9 years old. The rehabilitation hospital worked at getting my body back to normal. To keep my spine straight, I slept on a bed with a board underneath the bottom sheet. I was basically sleeping on a piece of plywood. And again, I had to lie in the bed on my back while sleeping, which was initially very uncomfortable. It's hard to get used to, but I guess the board did the job. I didn't have any spinal disfiguration. Next slide, David. In addition, twice a day, I was taken to a physical therapy clinic in the hospital, where I first sat in a warm whirlpool bath to stimulate my muscles. Then a rehabilitation nurse would stretch my muscles using massage and different types of exercises. And I couldn't find a polio picture. This is just a stretching picture, but this is the type of exercise they did. When I first started therapy, my muscles were weak and very tight. For one typical stretch exercise, I would lie on my back and a therapy nurse would have me lift one of my legs up toward the ceiling. When I first started therapy, I essentially could not lift the leg. The nurse would then push the leg further up. With tight muscles, think about how that's going to feel. And she would have me try and push the leg back down while the nurse resisted. Of course, that hurt a lot. The objective of all this stretching and exercise was to loosen and strengthen the muscles, so I dealt with the pain, knowing it would help me return to normal. Slowly, I regained strength and flexibility in my legs and arms. After about 2 months in the rehabilitation hospital, I started doing harder exercises to improve my strength further, including walking and stair climbing. After another month, I was discharged and went home. I had been in hospitals for 4 months. I couldn't go to school for another 2 months, so the school sent a tutor out twice a week to help me get back on track with my schoolwork. During those 2 months, I had to return to the rehabilitation hospital 4 times a week for more physical therapy sessions. So, 6 months after I contracted polio, I went back to school. Nobody wanted to do that more than I did. In retrospect, I was lucky. Other kids who caught polio went into iron lungs for a long time and never recovered normal activities. Others had to wear leg braces and use crutches or were in a wheelchair or had very curved spines. Others died. I caught polio virus in August of 1953. Went back to school in February of 1954. The summer of 1955, I played Little League baseball. I was very lucky. By the end of 1954, Joni Mitchell had developed and was testing a polio vaccine. By 1955, it was approved for use on children and adults. The country and the world rejoiced. Next slide. People ran to line up for the vaccine. Even though I had recovered from polio, which was thought to provide immunity from further infections, my mother took no chances and had me vaccinated twice. Once with the injectable Salk vaccine and once with the oral Sabin vaccine. I just wish a vaccine had been available in 1952. The side effect of polio was that a person could have recurrent effects long after they had supposedly recovered from polio. It's called post-polio syndrome. It is still too early to tell if such a fate will befall recovered COVID victims. Although I recovered, I was able to compete in intercollegiate athletics and pursue my passion of surfing. I still have some minor residual effects from polio. My right calf muscle is weaker than my left. And as I aged, I developed a paralyzed vocal cord, which is why I have a weak voice and get hoarse easily, like I am getting here, and have to clear my throat a lot. However, these are minor issues compared to the effect post-polio syndrome has had on others. I know that many of you know Bob Hedlund, a past member of this church who has a severe spinal disability due to polio. As a boy, Bob had a very serious case of polio and was confined to an iron lung for 5 months. After about 2 years, he recovered enough to lead an active, relatively normal life through his 30s. However, when he entered his 40s, post-polio syndrome set in, and he gradually lost all muscular control of his shoulders and now struggles to talk. As I said before, I was very lucky. So what form of polio did I have? Could I have the next slide, please? The doctors and my parents were unsure, but my best guess is, since I essentially recovered, is that I was in the 5% of cases that had non-paralytic meningitis form, which is debilitating but yields no or very limited paralysis. Like COVID, of course, there are various mutations and variants of the polio virus. And again, like COVID, the variants could have widely and varying effects on the infected individual. So, that is the story of my encounter with and recovery from polio. David, one more slide. I'd like to thank you for listening to my story. And if you haven't been vaccinated for COVID, please get vaccinated immediately. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck, for sharing your story with us. It's extraordinary. We never know the paths that each person has to take to get to where we are today. The next part of our service today is the offertory. As you may know, if you've been coming for a while, we've suspended having ushers pass the basket for safety reasons. But there are several ways you can support this church. The first is in the back of the church underneath the clock. There's a UUCT Sunday collection box. You can drop your checks or cash in there. You can also do it online by going to the church's website at uutampa.org and go to the donate button. See where my head is today, it's true. And the last but not least, you can just send a check in the mail to our address at 11400 Morris Church Road, Tampa, Florida 33637. Thank you very much for supporting this our church and for any contributions you've made to it thus far. Our closing words are going to be from Chuck, and I will extinguish the chalice.
For the closing words, I wanted to show a short YouTube video excerpt from a television documentary on Joni Mitchell, developer of the first effective polio vaccine. Salk was a modest man who never patented the vaccine. In a 1955 interview by the legendary reporter Edward R. Murrow, Salk was asked who owned the patent to the polio vaccine. His response was, well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? When I read and hear of people who now are avoiding a COVID vaccine that can prevent them from contracting a terrible deadly disease, I wonder if they know how very much an earlier generation suffered for 100 years from the dreaded deadly disease of polio, and then rushed to stand in long lines to be vaccinated once a vaccine was available. To me, it defies logic that people would not be vaccinated for COVID, which is much more deadly and much more widespread.
When we look back upon polio today, you look back upon what was really a summer plague. It came every year. It came like locusts. There was no prevention. There was no cure. There was no protection.
I grew up in a family where there was a sense, that my dad was a scientist. He actually would talk about how he used to, as a child, pray that he could do something good for humanity.
He was the miracle worker in the white coat on the one hand, but he was also an incredibly hard-working, devoted scientist for whom people were willing to sacrifice.
He was challenging medical orthodoxy.
All of the people who mattered in virology, John Enders, Albert Sabin, Tom Rivers, and others, basically believed in a live virus vaccine. And here is Joni Mitchell, someone who was younger, going in exactly the opposite direction.
He was well aware of the early vaccine failures. The first attempt with an inactivated polio vaccine killed kids.
It's a testament to his courage and resolve that he could inoculate children with something that he knew started out as live, dangerous polio virus.
The stakes couldn't be higher. Vaccines are always a matter of risk versus reward, and nothing is perfect. Nothing is perfect.
We didn't have to really be stimulated very much because up on the 3rd floor was the polio ward where they had all the iron lungs.
And I remember the faces on some of these kids, you know, in agony. Just picture your own 2-year-old. It's just dreadful.
The vaccination was 80 to 90% effective against paralytic poliomyelitis.
The guy gets off the elevator. He never got into the room. It works, they were yelling.
There were newspaper reporters that ran to telephones to quickly get this as a front page headline on probably every newspaper in this country.
Kids ran out into the street, factory whistles went off, church bells tolled. It was in a way as if a war had ended. Jonas Salk became a national hero. You know, he was on the cover of Time. Newsweek called him one of the greatest Americans. President Eisenhower invited him to the White House and actually broke down. This is a sign of how great American medicine is at this time. It is an extraordinarily wonderful, optimistic moment, okay? And there is reason to be proud. Jonas Salk is the people's scientist. Whom do we remember? Sigmund Freud, Albert Einstein, Jonas Salk. It's perfect.
That concludes our service. Please join us for coffee and fellowship in the area in front of the multi-purpose building, which is through the main doors and to the left. Thank you for coming. Going to be soon.